Now welcome Vesna and Katrin, and I think next up will be Vesna. So what was it, peer review of the policies and legal instruments in the compendium? Please, the floor is yours. Of course you can, yes.
Okay. So thank you for this invitation. In fact, I was invited to speak about culture policies and legal instruments in the compendium peer review of achievements, deficits, and future tasks. What a challenge, huh? When we speak about, I need to start somewhere, so I will come from general level to very specific. When we speak about legal instruments, we have in mind both regulation and legislation. By regulation, we understand the rules having the legal force for many purposes: to regulate, to set up some cultural organizations, to organize culture policy decision-making, to authorize, to prescribe, to provide funds, to sanction, to grant, to declare, or even to restrict. Regulation is being used and enacted by various public powers and authorities, legislature, executive branch ministries, regulatory agencies, professional bodies, etc. It covers the full range of legal instruments and decisions, from the Constitution, of course, bills, laws, to decrees, so secondary legislation, bylaws, orders, norms, etc., and often even gray regulations such as guidance and instructions, code of conduct, for example. That is regulation that does not have legal force, but still have to be considered as standard-setting instrument. On the other hand, legislation contains only those pieces of regulation that have been promulgated or enacted by a legislature power or another source of law, such as judge-made law or case law in Anglo-Saxon countries. Already this distribution shows the complexity of the legal aspect of culture policies. Our compendium approach tries to simplify it by dividing legal instruments into three categories: general legislation, starting with the Constitution and its cultural articles; division of jurisdiction, I am following now the compendium grid of chapter 5; financing rules, social security frameworks, tax laws, labor laws, copyright provision, data protection laws, language laws, and any other of general character, that is, those that are common to any sector of society, including culture when it comes to the aspect that these laws regulate. I believe it is a huge and very demanding task for a compendium author who is not a legal expert to find a way through the general legislation that is often even more decisive for the cultural sector than its own sectoral, that is, cultural regulation. To give a reliable and up-to-date description of legal issues that don't fall primarily under the responsibility of the culture administration, but might be in some cases under responsibilities of other ministries and sectors. So this might be, in some cases, even too demanding challenge or task. The general legislation indeed reflects not so much culture policies, but much more policies for culture, or culture in other policies, such as labor policy, tax policy, fiscal policy, foreign policy, etc. It is already an achievement in itself that compendium dares to go so far concerning legal frameworks for culture. Second component, categories, refers to culture legislation itself, mean embracing piece of cultural legislation that is not sector-specific, but regulate aspects that are common to different or all cultural fields. For example, founding of organizations or funding issues of cultural organizations and cultural activities and all other governance issues. If you look at the grid, you will see a lot of questions regarding these issues. The distinctions between, let me say, general cultural legislation in this regard and sector-specific cultural legislation can be misty, or some countries do not have specific transversal cultural regulation, as these aspects are already covered by general laws, so they don't have law on culture. Therefore, it is good that this sub-chapter 5.2 contains the list of legislation pertaining to culture policies and culture administration, and therefore give to the authors enough maneuvering space. It is possible to find in Compendium very impressive list of cultural legislation with a very good and interesting comments. And there is also a third part of legal chapter that is sector-specific legislation, which is dedicated to individual sectors, such as visual arts, performing arts, cultural heritage, literature and libraries, architecture and design, mass media, etc. And it is again required to focus when reporting about sector-specific laws on aspects such as policy objective and policy measures related to main policy aspects, that is founding, organization, funding, governance, and other issues of this kind. And here I would like to come to main problem I see. Legal chapter is very much oriented towards the legal framework of culture sector and its governance. Therefore, to questions such as legal framework defining culture policy principles, legal framework for the organization of culture services provision, legal framework for funding of culture institutions, appointment of directors, for example, and other main bodies, and also funding culture activities. So legal framework for governing in general, and also specifically. So legal aspects that define culture policy model of the country concerned. On the other hand, the rest of the chapters, apart the chapter 6, speaking about funding, elaborate different themes, items, and issues in culture policy development, from intercultural dialogue, social cohesion, cultural diversity, culture and creative industries, gender equality, in chapter 4, for example, to promoting creativity and participation in chapter 8. So not issues related to governance of culture, to culture policy issues of governance. There is indeed chapter 7, with public institutions in cultural infrastructure, but it does not cover the main governance issues such as the effects that public sector reforms had in the cultural field in European countries over the past 20 years. Yeah, I'm almost finishing. The changing conditions for public non-profit management due to governance and public sector reforms are not elaborated, which shows that Compendium is very much instrumentalized by political topics, such as intercultural dialogue, social cohesion, cultural diversity, etc., while little is known about how culture and art organizations are affected by policies and governance, especially due to governmental reforms. I don't want to say that the political topics, so policy issues and priorities, are not relevant and worse off reported. I just want to underline that the basic description of culture policy systems is missing in Compendium, and that there is a mismatch between legal chapter and the rest of chapters. At the beginning, it was not so, but by adding fashionable items, it lost its original character. If we compare, for example, a program of national reviews with what now we find in compendium, we cannot find any more direct linkage. Have you noticed this mismatch? Though I'm asking the authors. Do you find it problematic? There are two solutions in this case. One would be to reduce legal chapter in describing only the legal framework for the contents covered in other chapters. I am not in favor of this solution. I would prefer the second option, that is that we start to describe the culture policy system, so the culture policy issues of governance through its basic component, and give a picture how culture is governed, how culture is founded, how it is organized. In short, we need to focus again on governance of culture. Perhaps we can do it by developing Compendium Plus or Compendium Basic as a supplement created on the initiative of authors themselves, and their ownership will be then possible, at least for Compendium Plus. I think that today we already heard that some authors gave up fees to be paid for their work. So in this kind, authors are already shareholders in kind. So could be this a beginning of Compendium Plus that would really serve cultural sector again? Thank you.
Thank you, Vesna. I will not participate in that debate, at least not now, not here. But there was another thing, kind of where does the compendium and where does the cultural policy start and where do they end? And many of you are aware of, for instance, that what is the scope of the General Agreement on Trade in Services by the World Trade Organization, to which I think all our countries are parties to. And the scope is, that treaty applies to measures by members affecting trade in services. In the UNESCO negotiations for the Diversity Convention, many of us probably would have been inclined to have a similar formulation as to the scope of the convention, to say measures by parties affecting cultural diversity. Or well, of course, cultural diversity, not culture. But what that would mean, as Vesna was saying, that would mean labor policies, financial policies, taxation, immigration, you name it, all the world. So the point is, there are some issues mostly relating to economic prosperity, which of course is the purpose of trade policy, is to generate economic prosperity, that enable such an enormous scope for one treaty and for one policy sector. But the same level of ambition is nowhere to be found on some other sectors, culture being one of those, education would be one, social health would be further examples. So this is just to kind of a little bit provocate you. Now